Thank you so much, Caroline. We have time for questions. To whom can I give the floor? I'd like to give priority to the forum members and then to members of the audience. Please raise your hand and state your name. And let us know to whom you are directing the question. I'm sure this, yes. Lawrence, please. Lawrence Aber from the forum.
Thank you very much to each of the presenters, the keynoter and the two discussants. I get the feeling of enormous convergence of opinion that if we want to do something immediately, we need many flexible approaches, but the reliance on domestic spending becomes increasingly important with some opportunities for that. It leads me to be thinking about the politics of all this, and so I'm wondering if there's any thoughts about political processes that could help lead to such sensible coherence in finance policy in ECD.
May I conclude that this is really a question for Sumit, because he's been there.
Primarily, but you know, we all have opinions about politics.
See, as we saw what has happened in India for elementary education, the universalization or the nutrition program or the right to food, I mean, there has been widespread support for such actions, which I mean, have been created through campaigns, grassroots level campaigns, but then that comes up to the national government and the politics of it, and after all, at some stage it gets sort of multi-party support. Say the right to food, and in Parliament it got support from across parties when it came up. The right to education, when we actually went for the constitutional amendment, I recall, because that time Amarjit and I were both struggling with that, it got support from across parties. So something when a movement builds up, and we also had, of course, the judiciary, the judicial pronouncements, which created further pressure, then it's something which the political process has to, they have to address that, and that it has done. And the idea is how to keep that happening in the future.
Yes, please.
Just one additional quick comment on that. I think the local evidence is absolutely key for those political decisions. On the whole, people don't much care if the country next door has made a nice study and it's really demonstrating great returns on investment. People want local evidence, and that's very understandable. People are having to make very difficult decisions, never with enough resources. So we have found in multiple countries that having local evidence of children who have graduated from early childhood programs, dropping out less and repeating less, and now increasingly there's attention now to learning more, really does have huge value in influencing investments in early childhood, because those have got financial implications for the decision makers. If kids are repeating classes endlessly, that's got serious costs for the formal education system. And I think those are very helpful in each local context, really.
One short addition, what you see in some countries is that, for instance, Kenya is taking a leading role in its environment, and you see that the surrounding countries are really looking at Kenya and say, why don't we do it? Why don't we emulate the success? Cuba in another part of the world. You do see leadership from countries being emulated. Lorraine Scher was first, and then to Albert Lee.
Good morning. That was absolutely fascinating. I want to reflect on Pierre's story of the lake, and that when we all look into the lake, we see it's everyone together. But I would draw your attention that when you see a reflection, it's not real. And when you try and touch it, it just whirlpools away. And that's what I want to ask the speakers of the next session. Why is it that when we have investment, there's something wrong with value? So, for example, many of the early childhood providers, for example, particularly in Africa, are volunteers, are unpaid or low paid. It's about what value we put on them. Why is it that programs that we do import are profit-making programs, and then we talk about, I found your example of a 2%, just a ridiculously small amount. Why shouldn't this learning be free? We don't have education systems at the primary and secondary level for which we have to pay. So why isn't it in the early childhood sector? Why don't we have a policy that we only use programs that are free of charge, that are country level ones? So we have a lot of poor policies in how we spend the money, how we invest the money, and how we pay or don't pay the providers that maybe exacerbates the problem in this sector.
Yeah, Sumit, please. Okay. So, well, I think there's maybe a way between leaving a program entirely up to the market or up to the parents. In practice, that will be the parents, and entirely funding it publicly. What you see in a number of countries, and I hope this almost becomes a trend, is that countries say, if we cannot finance the whole program, let's finance the teacher. Put the teacher on the payroll. That's doable, because then you still keep, and I'm talking about education now, but you could think of similar constructions for health and social protection. Because it's more manageable, and then you still retain the advantages of the community-based nature, or the school-based nature, or whatever it is. In fact, if you cannot pay the whole teacher, you pay part of the teacher. You pay a stipend, and then parents will still top up by a fee, but the fee will no longer necessarily be prohibitive for families to participate. It will no longer create the disparities that we see now.
I'm totally with you, but I come from a system where you do expect to have free education, and my answer to you would be, it's because these centres would not exist on the whole unless there were some fees. And for me now, the absolute key is that it doesn't exclude anyone, so that I no longer really object to there being fees that are paid, as long as they are really, really, really careful that kids who are from families that cannot afford to pay are included. And I think communities are often very good at doing that. I mean, we've had very positive experience in both Central Asia and East Africa particularly of those informal local safety nets being in place. And I think it's right. I mean, our objective really is to get governments to take over the majority of operational costs, but as in almost every country, there is never going to be enough. So a small parental contribution does help keep things at a reasonable quality, even when most operational costs are absorbed. And I think it does really have implications for families, communities' sense of ownership. So often in so many countries, once kids go to school, it's like they're going into a black hole. I'm not going there, I have nothing to do with it. Families never feel that about early childhood centres. They always have this sense of, well, why didn't that teacher turn up for, a week? I'm going to go and see what's going on. And that's something that is still having to be built, in fact, for the formal education system. So I guess there are some pluses as well in terms of that real sense of engagement and ownership and entitlement to be getting something from the centre. But my heart is with you. Why are they paying anything?
We have some experience of a graded approach. For example, if one of our state governments, they required a huge lot of teachers. Initially, they paid the teachers less, some form of para-teachers. I mean, that's not a nice term to use, but teachers were paid less than the normal teachers. But over years, say over a period of 3 to 5 years, they would then come up to the regular pay scale of a teacher. Because in the meanwhile, the state finances would have improved. We have some experience of that. So you start with lower salaries, pay them lower, but you bring them up to scale later on.
I've seen hands and smiles from Albert, Pia, Hiro, and a number of people in the back. We go in that following order, but we still have time. We still have 10 minutes, so I give the floor to Albert first.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. My question probably mainly to Sumit, maybe to other speakers. I think I'm very impressed with some of the rights of the children and actually laid down by the Supreme Court decision, the judicial decision, further consolidate the rights of children is encouraging on one side. But on the other hand, bringing the case for civil cases from civilians to the court, the access to justice could be a very costly procedure and could be a lot of barriers, not that easy. And in certain many countries, the legal aid system not allowing, or definitely UK now, the substantial cut in legal aid is very difficult to bring this kind of case to the court for decision. And maybe you could enlighten us the experience in India, because the access to justice keep on popping up as a buzzword. I think it's very important that the rights of children, right, should have access to the justice or judicial decision, further consolidate the right. Maybe you could share your experience, access to justice, if anything conflict with the rights of children, especially early childhood development. Thank you.
We have, over the years, developed a strong, public interest litigation. That's really anything which I may go to the court, but it doesn't affect me individually. I'm taking up a public cause, and that's called public interest litigation, in which then the courts respond to that quickly. You don't have to pay the court fees and other related to that. But of course, you still have to use lawyers. Now, we also have certain NGOs, certain trusts who specialize in taking such matters to the court. For example, we have a body called Common Cause in Delhi, the issues as the ones I mentioned.
Thank you. We'll take questions from Pia and Hiro, and after that we really go to the general audience. Pia?
Thank you, Jan. Thank you so much for these presentations, and Sumit, in the making with that rich history that you presented to us. I guess I want to turn our attention a little bit to another side of this paradigm that Sumit raised, the bottlenecks in the process and the management of funds. While we wait for increases in sort of funding and investment in early childhood, we also have to try and make do with the funds we do have, and how do we improve the efficiency of those. And I want to highlight that because I think there is scope there to increase funding for children, and some work that Jan and Hiro and I did in many countries, including with Constanza in Colombia. We found a few levers to make that happen, but it's very few, so I would share those, but then I would like to ask your opinion. One is we found building the capacity at the most local level was very influential in increasing the capacity to spend funds, allocate funds according to how we could get output and results for children. So building that capacity really helped. But the places at which we found the bottlenecks or the weaknesses in the process we don't have answers for. So the sort of the Zilla and the Tehsil level, the offices are in charge of disbursement of funds. There is not that much capacity in understanding why they would spend it on a certain budget line as opposed to another. And we thought that if we could understand more of that, maybe the process could be further strengthened. So I'd actually love to hear if there have been any examples from India in that regard.
One way, of course, is to get the elected members, that's the panchayats, into this decision making. It's not left to the officials there. The panchayat, the elected bodies decide if there are sort of free float funds and funds which can one could opt to use in one manner or the other, but say affecting children, one affecting children, the other for some other activities. The panchayats, if they take a decision, it's possibly that one is they would really meet what are the local needs and ensure that the immediate need is fulfilled and the funds are spent for that purpose. I think so. It's in empowering panchayats by giving them both the functions and the finances.
A very brief comment. It is so true. Underspending is a huge problem. I mentioned leakage. Underspending can be huge in some countries. The money is there, it has been raised, it has been mobilized, it has been allocated, and it still doesn't get to the children. Hero, and then people on the floor.
Let me add my thanks for a great panel. I think the three presentations well together. My question's for former Minister Bose. From two themes that were in Jan's presentation, which is innovations or the strategies of per capita, tracking per capita spending, and then performance-based budgeting. And so, and I think some of your colleagues might be here tomorrow to talk a little bit about this, but it will be great to get your thoughts on you mentioned a lot of changes in the overall spending over the past 5-10 years that looked very impressive, but I did not have a sense there of the per capita spending in particular areas for kids, and or if there were initiatives in performance-based budgeting in any of those areas.
See, as I briefly mentioned towards the end, I mean, I should have expanded a little. We came up with something called the outcome budget. I mean, that's the closest to performance budget. Outcome budgets, I think it's about, I forget the year when the finance ministry introduced it for the first time, but maybe about 10 years ago. And in the first year, couple of years, the finance ministry sort of did it on their own, and then they left it to the ministries to come up with the outcome budgets. What happened is it really didn't turn out to be what was expected. I mean, really what was written down as the outcomes were not really outcomes. And I think we have a session at 4:30 today on outcomes, and I'm sure that will be discussed, of course, not only in the context of India, but so we had some experience with this sort of performance budgeting, and it has not worked out. And as I mentioned, the government has set up an Expenditure Management Commission, and of which I am a member. One of the tasks will be to ensure that sort of the outcomes, what are the outcomes in programs and how they are achieved, that we look at that.
Thank you, Sumit. We now go to take some questions from the general audience. We have some extra time, 5 extra minutes. The gentleman, I'm so sorry that I don't know your name. I'm sorry, but the first, yes, next to the aisle. Yes, exactly. You were the first to raise your hand. Please, ask your question.
I'm Sheshagiri from the UNICEF Office for the State of Chhattisgarh. I think one area which I expected a little more discussion on in the panel today was the issue of how integration can happen across different ministries and sectors. So the question that I would like to ask is specifically for Mr. Sumit Bose. What do you think is the relation between the issue of financing and financing for gaps in ECD and the larger issue of the three ministries of the center, the WCD, the health and education, coming together for young children, because I think this is a very frustrating thing on the ground. To have three verticals with their own workers, with their own schemes and policies, both at the center and state level. Talking actually happens between these three strands, and probably I think it may be the same situation in many other countries as well. So, and for a long time within the ECD community, we've been talking about the need for greater coordination, convergence, and so on. It almost seems like a mirage, but then I still ask that question, and I'm hoping that there'll be something concrete on it now.
See, you seem to be indicating, and perhaps rightly so, that one way to break this logjam is to do something with the channel of funding. That I mean, instead of giving funds to 3 departments, it's giving to whatever, the panchayat or something else. Maybe that needs to be tried out. It's not entirely a mirage. I mean, I have seen in Madhya Pradesh, in Ratlam, when Vinita, what was that project? Bachpan. This Nandi Foundation had initiated this Bachpan project. It worked remarkably well in putting together not only all the departments but the community. But it was very, very resource intensive. It required a lot of resources, I mean human resources. Those sort of human resources to commit across all blocks would be, I don't know if it's possible or not, but I appreciate the issue you have raised, and I do agree and admit that one did not spend enough time on it in our presentation. But this is where there's cross-cutting sort of or cross-sectoral work has to be done. Just the lack of coordination has often, even when funds are available, have led to inaction.
Just a brief comment. Your question also referred to the problem of budgeting across sectors, right? And I'd like to refer to the session of this afternoon at 3 o'clock, because there's a very interesting paper in the documentation to this workshop. It's about a program in Africa, South Africa I should say, Ilifa Labontwana, which is a program that cuts across sectors. And in that paper, there's a very good analysis of that particular problem, budgeting across sectors. To whom can I give the floor? The lady in the back row, yes, please. And again, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Morning, my name is Renu Singh. I'm from Young Lives India. I just was wondering, thank you for all the presentations, but my question is, how are we addressing inequities in young children through our funding? Because I know there are various players, but if we do not address the inequities which are coming through the private funding, the donors are of course trying to address that. But within the government, if the government sector quality is not addressed and children are moving, those with little bit of money are choosing the private sector, then there is a big problem at hand.
No, there is a problem at hand. That's why, I mean, this is not to wish away the private sector. This is not to say that private sector should not coexist. But if children, say, are moving away from schools and moving into private schools, the moment their parents have a little bit of spare cash, that is a problem, and it's pointing to the lack of quality in our schools. There's no doubt about it, and we have to address the issue of quality and ensure learning happens in the schools. There's no getting away from that.
I think it's a great question, and it's a huge issue for ECD globally. And there's going to have to be really deliberate efforts for us to get anywhere near meeting our commitments to EFA Goal 1. It's, you know, that graph I had up earlier, it's shocking, the inequities in terms of access, and it means that if one just looks at figures without actually disaggregating them, and I think that is one of the things we have to keep doing, both internationally and very locally, really drawing attention to who is and isn't getting access so that it is acknowledged as a problem and we really take active steps to make sure that services are reaching the kids who both need it most and will benefit most. It's a great question. Thank you.
I am so sorry that I have to close the session. Really, we got some extra time already. We resume at 11:45, and the next session will be moderated by Tamar Atinch. And please enjoy your coffee or tea or whatever drink you will take. Thank you so much.